There was a small market on the outskirts of the village, where all the locals flocked every Saturday. The sun's rays made their way through the dense foliage of the trees that lined the perimeter of the square, creating shadows in which shoppers sought refuge from the scorching African sun. The aromas of fresh fruits, spices, and freshly cooked dishes filled the air, mixing with the smells of damp earth and the sweat of the many bodies that filled the market. Adiola walked between the rows of merchants, holding the basket in the crook of her elbow. Her skin glistened with sweat, and the handkerchief tied on her head barely held back her long black hair. She stopped at every other counter, choosing the freshest mangoes and checking the quality of the rice she was going to buy. It was her usual Saturday routine to arrive at the market early so that she could buy all the necessary groceries before the heat became unbearable. This time, her attention was attracted by a small crowd near a new merchant who seemed to be offering something unusual. Curiosity got the better of her, and Adela headed there, carefully squeezing through the crowd. Her eyes met the bright red peppers and juicy greens that were lying on the counter, attracting the attention of all passers-by. But her gaze lingered on the figure, standing behind the counter, a tall man with a wide smile and muscular arms, who easily handled the goods. Ekin, her husband's younger brother. When their gazes crossed, Adiola felt a shiver run through her body. It was not just an unexpected meeting, but a collision with feelings that she had been trying to suppress for a long time. Akin saw her and immediately smiled even wider, as if he had been waiting for this moment. He put aside the basket of vegetables and walked past the customers to her.
Adela,
he said, his voice low and slightly hoarse.
I didn't expect to meet you here so early.
His smile was like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long rain. She couldn't help but smile back, even though the voice of reason was already ringing in her head, demanding that she keep her distance.
Yeah, I didn't expect to see you here either, Akin. Are you working in the market now?
Nothing. Temporarily.
He called her. He shrugged, coming closer.
I'm helping a friend. And you, as always, collect the best products for the house. Do you still care about my brother?
Her heart fluttered at his words. What right had he to speak to her so familiarly? And yet there was something attractive about it. His proximity was almost palpable. His scent, mixed with the scents of the market, seemed to permeate her to the very heart.
Yes.
She managed, trying not to meet his gaze for too long.
You know that I always try to do everything for our family.
Families?
He repeated softly, as if tasting the word. Then he took a step closer, so that only a narrow gap remained between them.
What about you, Adiola? Do you ever think about yourself?
She took a breath, and her chest heaved as she touched his hand, which was lying on the counter next to her. The warmth from his skin seeped through her clothes like a fire she couldn't put out.
Akin.
She tried to remain calm, but her voice faltered.
What are you trying to say?
He tilted his head to the side, studying her face as if trying to unravel something hidden deep inside.
I just think you deserve more.
His voice was soft, but at the same time filled with a strange confidence.
Don't you think that sometimes you need to think about yourself, about your desires?
Her lips parted slightly, but the words stuck in her throat. What did he know about her desires? About those secret thoughts that came to her at night when she was alone in a dark room, hearing her husband's calm breathing. How could he just talk about it like he'd known her all his life?
Mädchen, this is the wrong place and the wrong time.
She tried to turn away, but he was already there. His fingers gently touched her wrist, stopping her movement.
Then when, Adela?
He whispered in her ear, and her body responded to his voice.
When will you allow yourself to be yourself?
At that moment, time stopped. The world around them, the hum of the market, the laughter of children, the screams of sellers, all disappeared, leaving only the two of them in this bubble of intensity and tension. His breath touched her skin, and it was like touching a bare nerve. She felt her body responding despite her inner resistance. She took a step back, pulling her hand out of his grasp, but she couldn't take her eyes off his face.
I have to go,
she whispered, turning to leave the crowd. But her feet didn't move, as if they were glued to the ground.
Adiola.
He said her name with such tenderness that her heart sank.
You know where to find me if you want to talk. Or something more.
His last words sounded almost like a challenge, and she knew it was him, challenging her inner demons, her hidden desires, her fears and dreams. She turned around and left, but his voice and touch were still with her, like a bittersweet scar left on her soul. She was walking through the market, but thoughts of him were spinning in her head. She tried to focus on shopping, but all her thoughts were on Akin. Why did his words and looks move her so much? Why did she suddenly feel like her world was starting to crumble? Her heart was beating faster, and her breathing was ragged. She knew that her life would not be the same after this meeting. Akin had awakened something in her that she had been trying to suppress for a long time, something that made her heart beat faster and her eyes sparkle with desire. She tried to calm herself down, to tell herself that this was just a chance meeting, meaning nothing. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. She knew that this was the beginning of something new, something dangerous. When she left the market and headed home, thoughts of Akin did not leave her. She knew that this meeting at the market was just the beginning of their forbidden relationship, and even though she tried to fight it, something inside her already knew that she was going to lose this battle. In the evening, when the sun sank below the horizon, leaving purple-orange stripes in the sky, the village fell silent. Adeola returned home and, having finished all the household chores, tried to calm down. But the thought of meeting Akin at the market haunted her. There was something in his words and look that had awakened a long-forgotten passion in her, and now, being alone in the house, she felt her heart beating faster than usual. She went into the bedroom and sat down on the bed, thoughtfully looking out the window, behind which the evening wind played with the leaves of the trees. Suddenly, everything seemed strangely colorless and boring. Such evenings used to bring her peace and quiet, but today it was different. She felt that her life had begun to change slowly but surely, as if something inevitable was approaching her. Her thoughts returned to Akin. He wasn't just her husband's younger brother. He was a shadow that was always nearby but never crossed the line. Until today, she remembered how his warm fingers had touched her wrist, how his words had caused a tremor that had not disappeared until now. Adeola closed her eyes, trying to erase his image from her mind, but it was all in vain. Memories of the way he smiled, the way his eyes burned when he talked to her, came back to her mind. How he boldly came so close to her that she could feel his breath on her skin. Suddenly the door creaked and she opened her eyes. Her husband stood in the doorway, tired and dirty after a long day working in the fields. He went up to her, kissed her on the cheek, and, without saying anything, lay down on the bed. His breathing quickly became even and deep. He fell asleep almost immediately. But she lay next to him, unable to close her eyes, feeling a growing anxiety inside her. She got up, trying not to wake her husband, and went out of the bedroom into the dark living room. The silence of the house, which she had previously appreciated, now seemed deafening to her. Every shadow on the wall, every rustle seemed to be her call. She went to the window and looked out. The sky was full of stars, but her thoughts were far from that. She remembered Akin telling her that she deserved more. How he asked her if she ever thought about herself. Those words continued to ring in her head, like an obsessive melody that she couldn't get rid of. Maybe he's right. Had she lived too long for the sake of others, forgetting about her own desires and needs? Suddenly she felt her fingers begin to tremble. The desire she had tried so hard to suppress now flared up with renewed vigor. It was a feeling she couldn't ignore, a feeling that made her heart beat faster and her body respond to every outburst of her emotions. She quietly left the house and walked towards the small garden that was behind. The cool night air blew over her heated skin, but it did not bring relief. She knew what she had to do. Her legs guided her, as if someone else had taken control of her body. Akin lived nearby, in a small house on the edge of the village. Her steps became faster as she walked along the path leading to his house. She didn't think about what might happen. I didn't think about the consequences. Her mind was clouded by the desire and passion that had been building up in her every day since their meeting at the market. When she got to his house, she saw a dim light in the window. Her heart beat even faster as she walked to the door. She paused for a moment, but then, without giving herself time to change her mind, she knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if Akin was waiting for her. He stood on the threshold, his eyes glittering in the light of a single lamp, and the smile that haunted her appeared on his face.
Adeola,
He said softly, as if he knew why she had come.
you're here.
She didn't say anything, just stood there trying to figure out what to say. But the words never came. Her breathing became ragged as he took a step forward, coming almost close to her.
Why are you here?
He whispered, but his voice was filled with a strange understanding. She looked up and their eyes met. She saw in his eyes the same desire that was now raging in her chest. They stood there in complete silence, but that was enough. He gently touched her hand, and her skin burned under his touch.
I do not know.
She finally gasped, but there was uncertainty in her voice. She knew why she had come. She knew that she wanted to be here, next to him, despite all the prohibitions and fears. He took her hand and gently pulled her into the house, closing the door behind them. Their footsteps sounded hollow on the wooden floor, and every step he took echoed in her heart. They stopped in the middle of the room, and he turned to her, meeting her gaze again.
Are you thinking about us? What is it?
He asked. His voice was low, but there was determination in it. She nodded, unable to speak. Her breathing became rapid, and she felt her hands begin to tremble. He took a step closer, his body now almost touching hers. She could feel the warmth coming from him, and that warmth seemed to melt the ice inside her. He gently ran his hand over her cheek, his fingers gently touching her skin. Her eyes closed, and she felt her lips part slightly in response to his touch. It was more than just physical desire. It was something deeper, something she couldn't describe in words.
I can't stop thinking about you.
She whispered, her voice trembling with excitement.
Much my surprise. Since we met at the market, I can't stop.
His face moved closer to hers, and she felt his breath on her lips. She knew she shouldn't have been here, that it was wrong, but her heart told her otherwise. His eyes looked straight into her soul, and in them she saw a reflection of her own desires.
And you don't have to stop.
He whispered before his lips touched hers. It was a soft, gentle kiss, but it hid all the passion that they had both suppressed for so long. Her arms wrapped around his neck and she pulled him closer, feeling his body pressing against hers. They were so close that her breath mingled with his, their hearts beating in time. His hand slid down her back, and she felt her body respond to his every move. She knew it was forbidden. She knew they shouldn't have done it, but at that moment nothing else mattered. She felt only him, his warmth, his strength, and the desire that now filled her completely. Their kiss became more passionate, more intense. She felt her knees begin to give way, but he held her tightly, not letting her fall. His hands roamed over her body, finding all the sensitive points, and every time he touched her, her body responded with renewed vigor. They broke away from each other, both gasping, but their eyes wouldn't let go of each other. Adeola knew that this moment would change everything. She knew that her life would never be the same after that, but looking into his eyes, she also knew that this was what she'd always wanted.
I want this.
She whispered, and her voice sounded more confident than ever.
I want to be with you.
The summer in Nigeria turned out to be especially hot. The heat seemed to penetrate into every corner of the house, depriving it of coolness and peace. Adeola sluggishly cleaned the house, trying to distract herself from the thoughts that had been haunting her for several days. She couldn't get rid of the image of Akin, the memory of his touch and their kiss. Every time her husband touched her, or was just next to her, she involuntarily flinched, as if from an electric shock. Shame and fear overwhelmed her, but deep inside, the burning desire to see Akin again overcame all her fears. This day was especially unbearable. Her husband was at home all day, sometimes fixing something in the yard, then asking her about shopping at the market and plans for the coming days. She nodded, trying to smile, but her mind was far away from this house. When he finally went to a neighbor to help him fix the roof, Adeola felt strangely relieved. She realized that this was her chance. Conflict raged inside her. Part of her wanted to forget about what had happened and return to her usual life, but another part, darker and uncontrollable, demanded to continue. She stood in the center of the room, her hands shaking and her heart pounding in her chest. Her mind was racing, but her body already knew what to do. Without waiting for her mind to fight with her feelings, she grabbed her cape and left the house. heading for the very small house on the edge of the village where Akin lived. When she reached his house, her breathing became ragged. She tried to calm herself down, but a wave of desire overwhelmed her. There was not a soul around. Only a few birds flew overhead, and the branches of the trees rustled slightly from the weak wind. She knocked on the door, and her hand immediately jerked back, as if burned. A mixture of fear and expectation bubbled in my chest. The door opened and Akin appeared on the threshold. There was the same half smile on his face that had made her heart skip a beat more than once. He was silent, but there was a surprised joy in his eyes. He obviously hadn't expected to see her so soon, but he didn't ask anything. He just stepped aside, inviting her in. She took a step inside, and their bodies almost touched. Her breathing became faster, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. They were standing so close to each other that she could feel his warmth radiating from her skin. He closed the door, and the sound of it echoed in her head like a final blow, locking them in this small space where nothing else existed but the two of them.
You came,
He said softly, but there was no question in his voice. It was a statement, an acceptance of her decision. Adela didn't say anything. She just stood there looking at him, feeling her body being torn apart by desire and fear. He held out his hand to her, and she felt her heart skip a beat as his fingers gently touched her cheek. This touch was so light, almost imperceptible, but it contained all his tenderness and passion.
I shouldn't have come.
She finally said, her voice shaking with emotions she could no longer control.
but you're here.
He whispered, his lips so close to hers that she could feel his breath on her skin.
And I'm glad you came.
He moved even closer, their bodies almost touching. She could feel his warmth, and it was driving her crazy. Her hand reached out to him of its own accord, her fingers sliding over his chest, feeling his every breath. It was more than just a wish. It was a burning feeling that she had never experienced in her life.
Hey, Akin.
She gasped, and her voice was full of despair.
This is wrong.
But that's what we both want.
He replied, and his words sounded like the truth that had been obvious for a long time. His lips touched hers with such tenderness that she couldn't hold back the soft moan that escaped from her chest. This kiss was both soft and demanding, and it had everything she had been hiding for so long. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to immerse herself in this moment, forgetting about everything in the world. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer to him. She felt her body respond to his touch as her heart began to beat in time with his. His lips descended on her neck, and she gasped softly, feeling her mind blur with pleasure. He gently turned her around to face him and looked straight into her eyes. In his gaze, she saw not just desire, but also something deeper, something that made her heart clench.
Are you sure? What is it?
He asked, and there was a faint tremor in his voice. She nodded, unable to speak. Her breathing became rapid, and she felt her hands begin to tremble. He gently stroked her cheek with his finger, as if trying to calm her down.
If you say no, I'll stop.
He whispered, his voice soft but determined. She knew she could stop it at any moment, but her body and soul were screaming the same thing. She didn't want to stop. She wanted him. She wanted this moment. Despite all her fears and doubts, she took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and her lips met his again in a kiss full of passion and despair. She could feel her body burning under his touch, her heart pounding faster with every move he made. They slowly retreated to the bed, and she felt her legs give way as they sank onto the soft mattress. He covered her with his body. His lips were still on hers, and she felt his hands begin to wander over her body, exploring every curve of it. She moaned softly as his fingers slid down her back, his touch both gentle and demanding. He pulled away from her lips, and she saw his eyes burning with passion. Her breathing became rapid, and she felt her body respond to his every move.
I want this.
Neen, she whispered, her voice barely audible but determined.
I want you.
He smiled, and that smile was full of love and desire. He bent down to her again, and his lips touched her skin, leaving traces of hot kisses on her neck and shoulders. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to immerse herself in this moment, forgetting about everything in the world. His hands continued to explore her body, and each of his kisses made her body respond with renewed vigor. She could feel her breathing getting more ragged, her body burning with every touch of his. She knew that this moment would change everything, but at this moment she didn't want to think about the consequences. She only wanted him. They merged into one, and she felt her body and soul filled with a feeling of absolute happiness. She knew they shouldn't have done this, but at that moment nothing mattered. They were just them, their feelings and the passion that captured them completely. When it was over, they lay side by side, their breathing heavy and ragged. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not only satisfaction, but also love, which she could not ignore. She knew that this moment had changed them both, and now their lives would never be the same. The heat pressed down on the village, forcing everyone to seek safety under shady trees or by the quiet banks of small rivers. The days passed slowly, lazily flowing into the nights, but for Adeola and Akin, time flew by unnoticed. Their secret meetings became more and more frequent, and their communication became more and more tense. Every moment they were alone was filled with fire, which did not subside, but only flared up with renewed vigor. Every week, when Adeola's husband went on business, they met in secluded places. Their union, forbidden and vicious, was like a fire that they couldn't put out. There was so much insatiable desire in every movement, every touch, in every look that their hearts beat in time with each other as one. Today they chose a place far from the village, an old abandoned house overgrown with bushes and vines, a place where no one has looked for years. The ancient walls probably remembered thousands of stories, but their story was special, full of passion and prohibition. Adeola came first. Her heart was pounding in her chest with excitement, and she felt her every movement reverberate in her body with a sweet tremor. She went inside, kicking up a cloud of dust, and stopped in the middle of the room, where the light coming through the cracks in the walls illuminated the old wooden furniture. She slowly ran her hand over the table, feeling the roughness and cold under her fingers. The silence around her was deafening, but it didn't scare her. On the contrary, this silence was comforting, as if it said that at this moment, the two of them were the only people in the world. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. The silence seemed to be filled with their forbidden thoughts, their expectation. Suddenly, she heard a slight rustle at the entrance. She opened her eyes and saw Akin standing in the doorway, looking at her with that look that made her forget about everything in the world. There was a burning passion in his eyes, and the shadow of a smile played on his face. He didn't say a word, just watched her like a predator stalking its prey. He walked slowly inside, and every step he took sent an electric shock through her body. The room was stuffy, but she didn't care about that. She only cared about what was about to happen. Akin approached her, stopping a few centimeters away, and her breathing became rapid and ragged. She felt his closeness, his warmth, and it drove her crazy. His hand reached out to her face. His fingers lightly slid over her cheek, causing goosebumps on her skin. Adeola closed her eyes, enjoying his every touch. Her heart was beating faster and faster, and she felt her body tense in anticipation. He gently ran his fingers over her lips, and she involuntarily opened them a little, inhaling his scent, mixed with the scent of old wood and dust. He leaned closer, and her lips found his. There was everything in that kiss that they hid from the world: passion, burning desire, as well as despair and the realization that they couldn't stop. They forgot about everything except each other. His arms wrapped tightly around her waist, pulling her closer, and her body merged with his into one. The kisses became more and more greedy. Their breath mingled, and it seemed that the whole world was disappearing around them. He picked her up in his arms, without breaking the kiss, and slowly carried her to the old bed that stood in the corner of the room. Dust rose into the air, but they didn't pay attention to it. All that mattered was the two of them, their passion and desire. Akin laid her gently on the bed, and their eyes met. In his eyes she saw not only passion, but also something deeper, something that made her heart clench. He didn't take his eyes off her as his hands slowly began to explore her body. He wanted to memorize every line, every curve, every minute detail. Her breathing became rapid, and she felt her body respond to his every move. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to be completely immersed in this moment, forgetting about everything in the world. He was so gentle, but there was a power in his touch that made her body respond. With a new wave of desire, his hand slowly slid down, and she felt her heart begin to beat faster. Each of his kisses on her neck, on her shoulders, was like a hot trail, leaving a burning sensation on her skin. She felt her mind clouding, her body sinking into an ocean of sensations that she couldn't control. They moved as one, their bodies and hearts beating in unison. Each of his kisses, each of his movements caused new sensations in her, and she felt her soul filled with pleasure. She wanted this moment more than anything in the world, and she knew that he did too. There was so much passion in their every movement, in every breath, so much irresistible desire that it seemed they could burn in this fire. Her fingers slid down his back, feeling every muscle, every vein. She snuggled closer to him, her body responding to his every movement, every breath. She felt their bodies getting closer, their breaths mixing, their hearts beating as one. There was silence in the room, broken only by their breathing and the whispering of the leaves outside the window. They moved slowly, but there was strength in every movement. She could feel her body responding to his touch, her mind clouding with pleasure. She knew that this moment would change them both, but at this moment, nothing else mattered. She only wanted him, his touch, his body next to hers. They didn't need words. Their bodies spoke for themselves. Every breath, every kiss, every look said that they could not live without each other. Their bond was more than just physical intimacy. It was a passion that stretched deeper than one could imagine. They were like two halves that had finally found each other. Their meeting was not just an accident, not just a mistake. It was something more, something they couldn't explain, but they felt with their whole being. They knew it was wrong. They knew their relationship was forbidden, but they couldn't stop. They were attracted to each other with an inexorable force that would not let them rest. When their bodies finally separated, they lay side by side, their breathing heavy and their hearts still beating in unison. She looked at him, and in his eyes she saw a reflection of her own feelings. They didn't need words to understand each other. In that moment, they were one. A few minutes passed, and they lay in silence, hugging each other. His hand slowly slid down her back, soothing her, and she closed her eyes, allowing herself to enjoy this moment, forgetting all fears and doubts. But deep down, she knew that their meeting couldn't last forever. They lived on the edge, constantly risking that their relationship would be revealed. Every meeting was like playing with fire, but they couldn't stop. They were like moths flying towards a flame, knowing that it could destroy them, but unable to resist. She got up, looked back at him, and saw on his face the same smile that she loved. He looked at her with such tenderness that her heart sank. She knew that this moment would remain in her memory forever, but she also knew that they could not go on for so long. She dressed slowly and walked to the door, her heart still beating fast. He didn't move, just looked at her, and there was so much understanding in his gaze that it hurt her. She knew they couldn't date anymore, but she also knew she couldn't stay away from him. When she opened the door and went outside, the sunlight blinded her and she felt her heart tighten. She knew that their meetings had to stop, but deep down she knew that they could never really break up. Each of their meetings was like a last dance full of passion and pain, and they knew that this fire would never go out as long as they were alive. The sun was slowly sinking, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. The heat was unbearable that day, and the village seemed extinct. Only occasional footsteps could be heard on the dusty roads, and somewhere in the distance a dog was barking. Adiola, hiding her emotions behind her usual mask of calm, set about preparing dinner. She tried not to think about what had happened in the abandoned house a few days ago, but the memories themselves crept into her head. Every movement reminded her of Akin's touch, of his lips on her skin, of how their bodies merged into one. She pushed these thoughts away, but they returned with renewed vigor, causing her body to tremble. Every time her husband was around, she was overcome by a strange feeling, a mixture of guilt and fear. But there were times when she wanted to plunge back into the feelings she had experienced with Akin, forgetting about everything else. Everything went wrong that day. Adela's husband was supposed to go to a nearby village for a couple of days, but suddenly the plans changed. He returned home ahead of time, catching her off guard. She had not expected his return, And now, feeling the growing tension, she tried to behave as usual so as not to arouse suspicion. They were sitting at the table, eating dinner in silence. There was a tension in the room that seemed like it could be cut with a knife. Adiola's husband was lost in his thoughts, and she tried to appear calm, hiding the storm of emotions bubbling inside. She knew that another meeting with Akin was waiting for her, and her heart began to beat faster at the very thought. After dinner, her husband went outside to check on the household, and she felt a surge of relief. Her feet carried her to the door on their own, and she stole a glance outside to make sure he couldn't see her. Her heart was pounding in her chest when she noticed his silhouette in the distance, and she slipped out of the house without hesitation. She knew it was risky, but she couldn't stop herself. He and Akin agreed to meet at an old barn on the edge of the village, a place where no one went, especially in this heat. Her feet carried her along the familiar path, and each step reverberated in her chest. With a thud, she knew that their relationship could be exposed at any moment, but she couldn't give up on this fire that was burning her from the inside out. The barn was old and rickety, but it served as a safe shelter for their meetings. There was a smell of hay and dust inside, and an oppressive silence in the air. Akin was already waiting for her, and his face lit up with a smile when he saw her. They didn't need words. Their bodies spoke for them. They rushed to each other, and their lips joined in a passionate kiss full of burning desire and longing. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer, and she felt her body respond to his touch. They retreated into the depths of the barn, hiding from casual glances, and their passion flared up with renewed vigor. She felt his hands roam over her body, exploring every curve, every line. She responded to his touch, her fingers sliding down his back, feeling every muscle, every tense muscle. Their bodies moved in unison, their every gesture filled with passion, and she closed her eyes, enjoying this moment, forgetting about everything in the world. His kisses left hot marks on her skin, making her heart beat faster. She felt her breathing quicken, and her body was covered with a wave of pleasure. At that moment, they were just them, their passion, their desire. But suddenly something changed. She opened her eyes and heard the sound of footsteps outside the barn door. Her heart sank, and she abruptly pulled away from Akin. Her breathing was ragged and her eyes were wide with fear. She knew that this moment could ruin everything. The footsteps were getting closer, and she heard a familiar voice. Her husband. He was shouting something, his voice full of anger and suspicion. Her heart stopped and she felt a chill run down her spine. They were on the verge of being exposed, and she didn't know what to do. Akin quickly grabbed her arm and pulled her into a dark corner of the barn, where light barely penetrated through cracks in the walls. They held their breath, clinging to each other, their hearts beating so loudly that it seemed they could be heard outside the walls. Her husband entered the barn, and she felt her body tense up. He looked around the room, his eyes full of suspicion and anger. She saw how his gaze ran over every corner, how he searched for her, how he tried to find at least the slightest trace of their presence. Her breathing was barely audible, her hands were shaking, but she tried to hold on. She could feel Akin squeezing her hand tightly, trying to calm her down, but the fear was too great. She knew that if he found them, it would all be over. Their bond, their secret, their passion, everything will be destroyed. Her husband took a few more steps, his heavy boots creaking on the old wooden floor. He stopped, his eyes fixed on the dark corner where they were hiding. She closed her eyes, praying to all the gods that he would not come closer, that he would not see them. She could feel the sweat running down her back, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly he muttered something and turned around, leaving the barn. His footsteps slowed, and she heard him stop at the door, turning around. Her heart stopped. She could barely breathe, unable to move. She could feel Akin tensing next to her, ready for any outcome. Agonizing seconds passed, but they seemed like an eternity. Finally, her husband exhaled and, shaking his head, left the barn, slamming the door. They heard his footsteps receding, and only then did she allow herself to take a deep breath. Her body relaxed and she felt her legs give way. She fell to her knees, her breathing was heavy, and her eyes were full of tears. She had almost been exposed, and fear still held her down. Akin sat down next to her, hugging her, and she felt his warmth, his confidence, his strength. She knew it was too close. They were on the verge of being exposed, and it was too dangerous. But at the same time, she felt like she couldn't stop. Their bond was too strong, too powerful to be broken. She closed her eyes, letting herself drown in his arms, in his warmth, in his protection. She knew that they had to be careful, but at the same time she knew that their fire would not go out. They were like two flames that were attracted to each other, despite the risk of being destroyed. After almost being exposed, silence settled in Adela's heart. She stood in front of the old mirror in her bedroom, staring at her own reflection, and tried to figure out how things had come so far. The lines on her face seemed sharper, and the dark circles under her eyes betrayed sleepless nights. She ran her fingers over the mirrored surface, as if trying to erase the image she saw in front of her. In the reflection, she saw a different woman than she had been before. A caring wife, a reliable hostess. Now before her stood a woman torn by internal contradictions, tormented by hidden passion and secret fear. It had only been a few days since she had last met Akin, but it felt like years to her. Whenever she closed her eyes, her consciousness returned to the moment when they were so close to being exposed. The memory of his hands gripping her tightly, of his body that served as her protection, did not leave her. But at the same time, fear settled in my heart. She knew that their relationship couldn't last forever. They have risked too much, and one day their luck may turn against them. Adela slowly moved away from the mirror and went to the window. She looked out at the deserted street, where even the wind seemed to move slower under the weight of the sultry day. She knew she would have to make a decision soon. Heart and soul were enthralled, conflicting feelings. On the one hand, she could not imagine her life without Akin, but on the other hand, every time she returned home, she was overcome with guilt before her husband. She remembered every moment she spent with Akin, how his touch made her body tremble, how his kisses drove her crazy. Their bond was deep, almost animal, beyond logic and common sense. But at the same time, she knew it was destroying her. Their love was like a flame that, despite its beauty, burned everything around. She closed her eyes and pressed her hand to her chest, trying to calm the pain that was tearing her from the inside out. Her fingers felt a thin silver locket hanging on a chain. It was a gift from her husband on their wedding anniversary, a symbol of his love and loyalty. And at that moment, a wave of realization swept over her. Despite all her passion for Akin, she could not destroy what she and her husband had built. Her debt to her family was too great, and she knew she had to end this relationship before it was too late. Her decision matured in the silence of the night, when her husband was sleeping peacefully next to her, unaware of the storm raging in her soul. She knew she had to talk to Akin, explain everything to him, ask him to leave and not come back. She couldn't put herself and her family at such risk anymore, but just thinking about it made her heart ache. When morning came, she got up earlier than usual. Her steps were quiet and careful. She knew that today was the day when she would have to put an end to their story. Throwing a handkerchief over her head, she left the house and headed to the place where they often met. There, under an old baobab tree, hidden from prying eyes, they spent many hours immersed in each other, forgetting about everything in the world. As the road was deserted, and her heart was beating faster with every step, she knew that Akin was already waiting for her there. Their secret meetings became so familiar that they understood each other without words. When she got closer, she saw his figure standing in the shade of a tree. He looked calm, but his gaze was directed in her direction, and in that gaze she saw anxiety. She stopped for a moment, feeling as if her feet were rooted to the ground. Memories flashed through his head. Their first meeting at the market, their first kiss, the moment when they were almost caught. All this was spinning in her mind, making her heart ache. She knew that this was their last moment together, and she wanted to memorize every detail. Gathering her courage, she took one last step forward and approached him. There was a tenderness in his eyes that she loved so much, but at the same time she saw understanding. He knew that she had come to tell him something important. His hand reached out to her, and she allowed herself to feel his touch one last time. It was warm, reassuring, but at the same time she felt like there was a goodbye in it. They stood there, not taking their eyes off each other. Time seemed to stand still. All that could be heard was their breathing and the faint rustle of leaves under a light breeze. Her fingers were lightly touching him, and at that moment she felt something snap inside her. It was a sense of loss that she couldn't explain in words, and memories flooded back to her in a new wave. His arms that hugged her, his lips that left marks on her skin, his voice that whispered words of love to her. But at the same time, the realization came that they had to break up. Their passion was too dangerous. Their love was forbidden. She carefully removed his hand from her face and stepped back, feeling his warmth slowly leave her. She knew it was the right thing to do, that it had to be that way. But her heart was bursting with pain. She looked into his eyes once more, trying to remember him as he was at that last moment. Gentle, loving, full of pain, but understanding. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she turned to leave without giving herself any more time. She knew that if she stayed even a second longer, she wouldn't be able to leave. Her steps were fast, almost running, and she could hear her heart beating in time with those steps. She ran, trying to leave behind the memories, his image, their story. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing. She had to be strong for her family, for her husband. But even when she returned home, her thoughts were full of him. She knew she couldn't forget him, that he would always be a part of her, but she had to do it for the sake of her future. When she entered the house, she saw her husband sitting at the table. His face was calm, and he smiled at her as if nothing had happened. She returned his smile, hiding behind it all the pain and longing that tormented her from the inside. She knew that her decision was the right one, but she also knew that her heart would take a long time to heal this wound. Night covered the village, and Adeola lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her husband was breathing next to her. His calm breathing was her only comfort. But her thoughts were far away. She thought about what had happened, what she had lost, and what she had gained. She knew that she had made the right choice, but she also knew that she would never forget him. She closed her eyes, and his image appeared before her again. His smile, his eyes, his hands that held her in the most difficult moments. She knew their story was over, but there would always be a light burning inside her, reminding her of what had happened. She took a deep breath and tried to calm her heart, knowing that time heals all wounds, but some scars remain forever. There was a void in her soul that she couldn't fill with anything. But at the same time, she knew that life went on, and she had to live on, with this knowledge, with this pain, but also with hope for the future.